Hello everyone, and today I will be reading Hidden Figures, Young Readers Edition. New York Times best-selling author Margaret Leah Shetterly, the untold true story of four African American women who helped launch our nation into space. Prologue. Growing up in Hamptons, Virginia, I assumed the face of science was brown like mine. My dad worked at the Langley Research Center at NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. He started as an engineering intern in 1964 and retired as an internationally respected climate scientist in 2004. Our next door neighbor taught physics. Our church pews were crowded with mathematicians. I knew so many African Americans working in science, math, and engineering that I thought was just what black folks did. My father, who was a high school student, had wanted to study electrical engineering, lived in a different story because of a physical education teacher. My grandfather told him he thought my dad would have trouble finding work as an engineer. In the 1960s, most college education African Americans took teaching jobs and worked for the post office. As late as 1970, just 1% of all American engineers were black, and my father was one of them. Because of my father's job, I was part of the NASA family. I grew up saving my allowance to buy tickets to ride ponies at the annual NASA carnival and sharing my Christmas wish was for the Santa at NASA holiday party. On Thursday nights, I sat with my family and cheered for the stars. My dad's NBA team, that's the NASA Basketball Association. My Sunday school teacher worked at NASA as a computer, doing the complex math for aerospace engineers. She wasn't alone. From the 1940s through the 1970s, hundreds of women, many of whom were black, worked as mathematicians at NASA. It wasn't until I was older and I appreciated just how extraordinary this occupation was for black women in the South during the days of segregation. The first 5 women were hired at Langley as computers in 1935, and they were white. 10 years later, there were more than 400 women working at mathematics. Many of them were black. The contributions made by these African American women had never been heralded, but they deserve to be remembered, and not a side note from someone else's account, but they're a center of their own story. These women should be celebrated not just that because they're black or they're a woman, but because they're important to American history. This is their story. Chapter 1. Setting the Scene. Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darling loved math. As children, they saw special skills in arithmetic, and they went on to study mathematics in college. After graduation, they worked as teachers before going to work as quote-unquote computers or mathematicians for the government's Air and Space program. Over the years, hundreds of women worked as mathematicians for the federal agency called the NASA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. This researched a permitted study of flight, but these women were among many who distinguished themselves with their talents and hard work. Dorothy Vaughan was a pioneer. She joined the NASA in 1943, the first year the agency began hiring African American women as computers, and she was the first to be promoted into a management position. She was a role model for other women, and she helped to steer the careers of many talented women who were joining NASA. Mary Jackson was the first African American woman to move up the ranks and become an engineer at the NASA. She was a fighter, standing up for herself and for other women who deserved the chance to prove themselves. Her work helped make supersonic aircraft fly higher and faster. Katherine Johnson was an African American woman who became an essential member of the team that put the first American on orbit around Earth. She was a dreamer and an independent thinker who was unafraid to imagine what others considered to be impossible. She helped do the math that was required to send the first man to space and bring them home to safety. Katherine Darden was an American African woman who became one of the world's leading experts in supersonic flight. She became the face of the next generation of female space scientists. Her groundbreaking research on predicting sonic booms is still used today. The accomplishments of these four women were remarkable, but their work was even more impressive because it was achieved while living and working in the South during the time when racial discrimination was commonplace, and where most women with an interest in math were expected to become math teachers. A different time. In the 1800s, after the Civil War, the government passed laws that ended slavery and granted full citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. Later, however, many state and local governments passed other laws that legalized racial segregation. These regulations, which were most common in the South, kept black people and white people apart in many situations. 1. They could not eat in the same restaurants. 2. They could not drink from the same water fountains. 3. They could not use the same restrooms. 4. They could not attend the same schools. 5. They could not ride on the same parts of buses. 6. They could not live in the same neighborhoods. 7. They could not receive care in the same hospitals. 8. They could not visit the same beaches. 9. They could not compete in the same sports teams. 10. They could not sit in the same sections of movie theaters. 11. They could not marry someone of a different race. And lastly, 12. They could not even be buried in the same cemeteries. Technically, African Americans have the right to vote. However, many local laws made it impossible for them to do so. Some communities levied or charged poll taxes or enforced literacy requirements or imposed other restrictions that made it difficult or impossible for black people to register and vote. And since people who are not registered to vote aren't allowed to serve in juries and run for political office, many African Americans were deprived of the civil rights as well. During the 1930s, the United States experienced the Great Depression, a decade-long period of economic struggle. Jobs became difficult to find and wages decreased dramatically. All Americans suffered, but African Americans faced the most serious challenges in finding work. For many African Americans, World War II was an opportunity to make a better life for themselves and their families. Black men enlisted in the military in large numbers, even though they served in separate black infantry regiments, usually overseen by white officers. They believed that their loyalty and patriotism would help blacks to earn rights and white citizens had. Women also enlisted in the army, or they were called WACs, for Women's Army Corps. And they were served in all female units in the Navy too. And for women like Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, World War II opened the door to a career as a professional mathematician. Each of them found their way to Langley Laboratory, where they met one another and women like them, smart, brave, confident, and good at math. The war was changing the world, and it would change their lives as well. Chapter 2. A Door Opens. The newspaper ad caught the attention of many women. It read, "Reduce your household duties. Women who are not afraid to roll up their sleeves and do jobs previously filled by men should call it the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory." A few years earlier, an ad like this would have been unthinkable. Most employers never would have considered a woman doing the job that's always been performed by a man. But in the spring of 1943, with World War II in a full swing, and many of them officers in the military, the country needed all help the help they could get. Employers were beginning to hire women to do jobs that had once belonged only to men. This this particular ad was placed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NASA, a government agency dedicated to studying the science of flying. The NASA shared a campus with the U.S. Army Air Corps in Hampton, Virginia, a city where the southern eastern part of the state next to the Chesapeake Bay. The NASA's mission was important and unique to help the United States develop the most powerful and efficient airplanes in the world. Airplanes moved military troops, tracked enemies, and launched bombs. World leaders felt that the country that ruled the skies would win the war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt believed in the importance of air power, so 2 years earlier, in 1941, he had challenged the nation to increase its production of airplanes to 50,000 units a year. At that time, the industry had manufactured only 3,000 planes a year. NASA and private industry were up for the challenge. By 1943, the American aircraft industry was the largest, most productive, and most sophisticated in the world, making 3 times more airplanes than the Germans, who were fighting on the other side of the war. Victory through air power. Before manufacturers built the airplanes, the designs were developed, tested, and refined at the Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, which is where the NASA had first began its operations in 1917. The engineers created wind tunnels to simulate or imitate different conditions a plane could encounter when flying. This helped the engineers to test airplane parts as well as the whole aircraft, examining them for any problems like air disturbance or uneven wing geometry. After that testing, pilots flew the planes, trying to assess how the machines handled in the air. Did the aircraft roll unexpectedly? Did it stall? Was it hard to guide or maneuver? Making small changes to the design added up to a difference in performance. Even tiny improvements in speed and efficiency multiplied over millions of pilot miles added to a difference that could tip the balance of the war. People working at Langley knew that they were doing their part to win the war. Victory through air power, said Henry Reed, the engineer in charge of the Langley Laboratory, and the workers took their mission to heart. Wanted, female mathematicians. Each of the engineers at Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory required the support of a number of other workers, craftsmen to build the airplane models, mechanics to maintain the test tunnels, and number crunchers to process the data they were collecting during the tests. For the engineers, a plane was basically a complex physics experiment. Physics is the science of matter, energy, and motion. Physics meant math, and math meant mathematicians. At the Langley Laboratory, mathematicians meant women. Female mathematicians had been on the job at Langley since 1935, and it didn't take long for the women to show that they were just as good or even better at computing than many of the male engineers. A few of the women were granted the title mathematician, which have put them on equal footing with some male employees. Instead, they were classified as sub-professionals, a title that meant they could be paid less. At Langley, the female mathematicians were called computers. They did the computations that turned the results on the raw data gathered by the engineers into a more useful form. Today we think of computers as machines, but in the 1940s, a computer was just someone whose job to do the computation, a flesh and blood woman who was very good with numbers. In 1943, it was difficult for Langley Laboratory to find as many qualified women as they needed. A recruiter from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics visit colleges in search of young women with analytical or mathematical skills. The human computers. When the managers couldn't satisfy the demand with only white employees, the government decided to hire African Americans. A civil rights leader named A. Philip Randolph encouraged President Roosevelt to sign an executive order, a law that ordered the desegregation or the federal government and defense industry and created a Fair Employment Practices Committee. This executive order opened up a new, exciting opportunities for African Americans, allowing them to work side by side with white people during the war. The federal government also helped create special training classes at black colleges where people could learn the skills they would need to be successful in war jobs. Black newspapers like the Norfolk Journal or Guide published articles telling the readers to apply for the new job openings. And there were many applicants. The applications were not supposed to consider race. A recent law had done with the requirement that the application must include a photo, but it wasn't hard for the employers to figure out which job candidates were black. African Americans did not have access to white colleges and universities, so black applicants came from black colleges such as West Virginia State University, Howard University, Hampton Institute, and Arkansas Agricultural, Mechanical, and Normal College. Many of the African American candidates had years of teaching experience as well as math and science degrees. Once hired, the black mathematicians were assigned to a separate workspace at a warehouse building on the west side of Langley campus. The East Area computers were all white. The West Area computers were all black, except the supervisor and her assistant, who were white women. There had always been African American employees at Langley, but they had worked as janitors, cafeteria workers, mechanics assistants, and groundskeepers, hiring black mechanics, mathematicians, but that was something new. For the most part, the engineers welcomed extra hands, even though those hands were black. The Langley Laboratory was operating around the clock to test airplanes to be flown by American soldiers in the war. Everyone had a job to do. Hampton, Virginia, where the Langley campus was located, was very much a southern town. State law and Virginia custom meant that the African Americans did not ride the same buses or eat in the same cafeterias or use the same bathrooms as whites. The Langley staff had to prepare for the arrival of African American mathematicians. One of the tasks created metal bathrooms that signs that said "Colored Girls." For the black woman, the experience of working at a laboratory offered the chance to do something interesting at work, the while to help to support the war effort. Walking into an unfamiliar environment wasn't easy for the woman new at West Area Computing Office, but each of them was eager for the opportunity to help their country and prove that they, too, could be excellent mathematicians. To be continued.